Okay, can I start now? Yes. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Shields-Hivard. I'm a second-year student in the Masters of Art History program at Concordia, and I am president of AHGSA, the Art History Graduate Student Association. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. I have a... Oh, it's not there. Okay, then I won't. So we wish to welcome you to our 15th annual symposium titled Empathie, Empathie. This conference hopes to address questions around empathy as it relates to art practice, theory, and history. We are interested in exploring the role of the arts in bridging the gap between feelings and actions, especially regarding issues of gender, sexuality, race, class, and ability. We are also concerned with the limits of empathy and what empathy can and cannot do with regards to reconciling discrimination and privilege. Before we begin, we would like to start with the Territorial Acknowledgement, so I will hand it off to our Special Projects Coordinator, Michelle Sones.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So we want to begin by acknowledging that the host institution of the Symposium, Concordia University, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. Who are joining from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, where I am from, the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We recognize the injustices that are part of the colonial history of this place, and we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationship with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. While Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform that we're gathering on today, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we're physically located. Zoom's headquarters are located on the Muwekma Ohlone territory in what is currently known as San Jose, California. Today and tomorrow, our symposium joins together speakers, students, faculty, and peers from across Turtle Island and around the world. We strongly encourage you to continue actively learning about the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize the lands that you are on today. And we just wanted to shout out that there's a great tool. There's a nativeland.ca. It's an app that allows you to see whose lands you're located on all around the world, actually.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So we will be leaving the chat open for the next few minutes. If you wish to share with the attendees today your name, your academic affiliation, as well as where you're tuning in from. However, once the presentation starts, we will be closing the chat and only leaving the Q&A box open, where you'll be allowed or able to pose any questions you want to the presenter, as well that the moderator will be asking at the end during the Q&A period. And you can start asking those questions at any point. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank our funding bodies, so namely the Department of Art History, the Gail and Stephen Jaroslawski Institute for Studies in Canadian Art, the Graduate Student Association, and the School of Graduate Studies. Thanks also to Brooke Skivel and Jordan Goldman, who will be providing live ASL translations today. And finally, we would also like to thank our amazing team of volunteers that will be around all weekend, and our special project coordinator, Megan Gaudet, and our Vice President, Maggie Hinbest. Michelle, if you can take it.
Yeah. So this evening, we are honored to host the opening keynote presented by Dr. Lauren Fournier and moderated by Dr. Rebecca Duclos. So Dr. Lauren Fournier is a writer, curator, filmmaker. She teaches artist writing, auto theory, and auto fiction, and other new genres at the University of Toronto, where she is a postdoctoral fellow in visual studies. Her book, Auto Theory as Feminist Practice in Art, Writing and Criticism, was recently published by the MIT Press in 2021. She has written features and reviews for venues like C Magazine, Canadian Art, and Public Parking, and has edited the artist-led collections Fermenting Feminism and Critical Booch.
Dr. Rebecca Duclos is currently professor in the Department of Art History at Concordia, who began as a part-time faculty member in the Department of Studio Arts and recently concluded her mandate as Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts. In addition, she has held positions across Canada, the US, and the UK in educational, academic, and cultural sectors as an independent curator, professor, and dean, namely the graduate dean at the School of Art of the Art Institute of Chicago. Currently, she is teaching courses on museological modes, critical interventions through objects and architectures, and on the compulsive browse, forms of attention and production in the arts, which I would love to be taking right now. So Lauren, I will pass it to you.
Great. Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here. And I'm speaking to you tonight from the Treaty 4 lands in Saskatchewan on the territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, as well as the homeland of Métis Michif Nation. And so before I begin, I just want to note that I would encourage you all, perhaps unusually for an art history lecture, I'm prioritizing the audio over the visual tonight. And so I do have some PowerPoint slides I'm going to be sharing. You'll notice that you'll see the PowerPoint slides on the left-hand side once I share my screen right away here. And that is deliberate. That's just my own logistical constraints here with my monitor situation. So I will be showing a couple of images throughout, and I will signal when I am switching images. But for now, if you feel compelled to step away from the computer, to step away from the screen, I would encourage you to do so. I know a lot of us are feeling quite zoomed out and our eyes are tired from looking at screens. So if you want to, lay down, recline, find a comfy position to listen in, and I will begin. So here in the contemporary art world, we have high standards for how we should treat each other. Care has been one way that these standards have been described, a word that gives structure to a more diffuse sense that we have some moral obligation toward each other, even in, or perhaps especially in, professionalized contexts. We have high standards for how we should take care of each other as artists, as academics, and, as I'll focus on primarily today, as curators. In recent years, the discourse of care has emerged not only as a theme of interest for artists and curators to explore in their work, but also as an imperative to action, as an ethics of living together in the arts and academia that fosters support networks. The language of care has been shaping the way we understand contemporary art and curation for at least the past decade, with care really buzzing as a keyword these past 5 years. But even as the rhetoric of care breezes through these spaces, it should not be assumed, I think, that care is a default, or even an easy way of being in the institutions that we navigate. Institutions that are themselves built on and founded in histories of colonialism, slavery, and patriarchy, and which continue to operate, even with recent indigenizing efforts, in largely neo-colonial ways. And so where does this leave us as people in the art world for whom ideals of care are important? For whom ideals of care are necessary and urgent even? And what happens, just as importantly, when those standards of care inevitably fail? Because failing to achieve these high standards at all times does indeed, at least I'm going to propose today, and we can think about this together, seem inevitable. In Helena Reckitt's 2016 article in the Journal of Curatorial Studies, Support Acts, Curating, Caring, and Social Reproduction, Reckitt posits curation in relation to its etymological roots in curare, or the verb to care. Reckitt looks specifically at this historical trajectory of curatorial practice from the curator as one who fulfills the role of caretaker of a given institution's collection. And here you'll find language more tied to maintenance and custodial work more than you do to creative authorship. And the shift then to the role of the curator now as more of an auteur, one who has an authorship role and it would follow an authorial role too. I have some allergies here, so I apologize. With the auteur theory of curating, so critiqued in texts like David Balzer's Curationism, curators are seen as suspect in the sheer power and influence they possess in these roles. Most cynically, their art practice could be seen as using works by artists as their medium, in a certain sense, demonstrated nowhere more clearly, perhaps, than in the case of the thematic group show. It is here, as Balzer puts it, where individual artists' works risk being eclipsed and assimilated into the larger group thematic, which then feeds into the curator's authorial position and power. Bringing things full circle, enter the multi-artist group exhibitions that are themselves themed around issues of care, a few of which I have had the pleasure and ambivalence of being a part of and of having led. In her article, Reckitt is most interested in the challenges facing curators today, where their role is largely one of actually taking care of and maintaining not the artworks themselves, so much as the interpersonal networks and social relationships that surround those artworks and art institutions. The role of the curator today, it seems, is to take care of the artists and the artworks, and the many entangled social relationships and networks surrounding those. And so if we, so the curator, entangled with these many social networks that they're maintaining, the networks that surround the artists, the artworks, and the curator themselves, as well as the institution with which the curator, if we assume a freelance or independent curator position, as I, for example, have always worked, is contracted. And maybe it is no longer possible for us to differentiate between the artist and the artwork, after all. Our collective psyche no longer able to or interested in seeing the two as discrete. The art has been made by a human artist with human actions in the world who felt compelled enough to bring this work to fruition. This artist is quite likely still alive, at least in the case of exhibitions curated by many of us more emerging contemporary art curators. And so working with the artists themselves is going to be a part of that process. Sometimes that artist and curator might even work collaboratively in the process of exhibition organizing and design, as in the case of practices. Some anecdotal examples that come to mind from my own lived experience, would include approaches by Kim Simon during her many years at Gallery TPW, or Emily Changer during her many years at the AGYU. So what does this mean for curatorial programs from a pedagogical standpoint? Should there be a course on how to take care of ... the many factors for which curators are seen to now be required to take care? Considered not only through a maintenance and infrastructural perspective, but also through an affective and embodied one. Are curators now therapists of a sort? Are curators social workers? Far from just a buzzword, and really is anything ever just a buzzword, care is something we have to take seriously, aesthetically as well as politically. And as a side note, I do compel you to always look deeper into what can be written off as just a trend. Care takes a discursive form in contemporary art, sure, but it is also fundamentally material and relational, implicating real bodies with real human lives and real feelings. Care involves people in space and time, enacting an action of caring for or something or caring for someone. Recently, in speaking with an artist friend about what I see as a crisis of care in the arts, my friend offered that the problem might be the unreasonably high standards of behavior that we set for each other. When the standards are so high, more like ideals really, we're arguably setting ourselves up to fail. Because who can be caring all of the time? And what if you're struggling to pay rent? Are working multiple jobs to keep up your practice? Are struggling with mental health issues without adequate coverage for therapy? Are caring for dependents at home? Even the highest paid or even the highest paid and highest positions in artists or in culture in major city centers like Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, pay salaries that flirt with the poverty line. And so a director then is seen as having all of the power and responsibility of an institution, because in a certain sense they do, and can be called out accordingly, but might also be struggling themselves with material precarity and feelings of burnout. I am already finding this in my own life, teaching as I do as a sessional instructor at 2 different institutions in Toronto, and having to sit with the fact that I do embody the face of the institution for these students, even if my relationship professionally and materially speaking with that institution is fundamentally temporary and at times tenuous. So this is the plight, perhaps, of the adjunct faculty, the part-time faculty, the contract worker, the independent curator, who understands the enormous responsibilities that they hold in, say, directing a course and teaching it as best as they possibly can, while also acknowledging that they have no job security, no health benefits, based on course load, and so on. So they might be enormously precarious themselves and struggling to find the energy to do their work, let alone the work of caring. And who cares for them? I felt this particularly strong this past year. I've been teaching courses online, grateful for the work, from first year through third year undergraduate and now graduate courses, and have been doing so since April of last year. I have seen the ways that many students are struggling with online learning and the many varied challenges that come with the pandemic moment. I know they are struggling to stay motivated through the many 3-hour Zoom classes, and that they're wrestling with the same questions that many of us are wrestling with as instructors, including whether you can have online art school and how we can make the digital learning environment more embodied, human, and humane. As an empathetic sessional, I can imagine what they're feeling, start to feel it myself too, on top of the emotions I feel already as an empathetic instructor, as an independent, meaning contract-based curator, and as the person who is the face of these institutions without, as I noted, necessarily having the backing of those institutions, without having the kinds of infrastructural support that full-time faculty have. And I do not invoke this example for purposes of pity or even pathos for the plight of the sessional instructor, knowing too that even the full-time instructors are really struggling through the shift to online learning, and knowing also that I'm not particularly interested in hierarchizing pain. Instead, I'm naming this to acknowledge a situation where I have power and responsibility to support those and to care for those who need that support and care in the form of my art students, university students, but art students specifically. And that I myself do not feel I have the capacities always to adequately support them from an affective standpoint. But still I try, as I know many others do, and I will extend myself to them, because that is how I teach and because that is what I want to do. But I also know that this is not a sustainable model. I could not do that, I don't think, for the rest of my life on a sessional salary. I know the good folks who try and who do, and who are now getting older and realizing that this is a very hard path to stay on. I know I am not, nor can I be, these students' therapist. I know that and understand that that exceeds my role, technically, though the art studio class and the creative writing studio class can become a kind of therapeutic space. Because I'm empathetic and because I'm a human being who is hearing them express their struggle and pain, it is hard to ignore it. In a week on artist manifestos for my artist writing class, we break out into groups and the students write manifestos for fictional collectives. One group, called D-Zoom, riffs on the form of Yvonne Rainer's No Manifesto that we discussed that day to refuse the many aspects of online learning that they're subject to right now, including in my class. No to 3-hour classes, no to Zoom, no to screen time, yes to movement. And I want us to move. I want us to get us away from the screen. I have this image up of Lisa Steele's Waiting for Lancelot, a single channel video that the artist made in 1976 that tells a fictional story based on the King Arthur Lancelot Guinevere legend. Quote, throughout the tape, I tried to maintain a visual silence. That is, the images may change frequently, but movement within each frame is kept to a minimum, Steele writes. I was drawn to this image of Steele from some kind of instinctual place when I was working on this keynote on empathy. I didn't necessarily think about it too much, but I kept returning to this image as I was writing. Steele holding the barbell up in the air, pushing it up with her arms, and then holding her neck cranked back. There's a strength and a grace, but also a struggle, fundamentally not to move, to hold the motion, to capture it in a kind of slow-mo. There is something refreshing, I think, about this visual silence that Steele speaks of back in 1976, at a time now in 2021 where our eyes are always looking at screens. You know, at least that's how it feels from my experience these days. Our brains need a rest, as do our guts, the place where we feel intuition and empathy, that gut feeling, and then the vagus nerve, which empirical scientific research is increasingly validating as the bundle of nerves that connects the mind to the gut, and which can be stimulated and toned, the internet tells me, by stretching, by humming, by singing, by laughing, by gargling, by moving, by exercising, by taking a cold shower, and by relaxing your jaw. Burnout is a real problem in the traditional industries of care work, something I witnessed firsthand in my years working as a frontline mental health and harm reduction worker in Vancouver. I came into that position with a master's in English literature recently completed, an experimental thesis paper written about performance art and the performativity of everyday life via frameworks of autoethnography. I could not find paid work in the arts. Volunteering in artist-run culture at Vivo Media Arts and elsewhere, and still working as a teaching assistant up at SFU, I applied for a job in what has been caustically called the poverty industry in Vancouver's downtown east side. I stepped into the position with little to no credentials, aside from what seemed to be my empathetic nature and my interest in doing this kind of work. That I had a master's degree, even in the humanities, was something shockingly respected by the manager who hired me on the spot, later signing me up for community-based training in modalities that would be useful for the position, including vicarious trauma and nonviolent crisis intervention. I worked there for 3 years, and to this day, it was my favorite job that I've ever had. Something that felt enormously natural to me, but also fundamentally unsustainable. The ultimate spook. I am in conversation with one of our many clients who is now straight entrenched with mental health struggles and substance abuse issues, who tells me that he was once a social worker himself. Burnout abounds in care work, including social workers, but also more and more educators. Why might that be? Well, the obvious answers seem to be the combination of thoroughly draining work, when you have your body, your heart, and your mind all in there, caring every day, for people who might demand higher levels of care and support than usual, in contexts that do not adequately support that kind of work, and that do not recognize the toll that it takes, and the need for, say, regularly scheduled mental health days, or proper paramedical health benefits, including having access to therapy yourself. I ended up leaving the frontline social work to do a PhD program in Toronto, seeing that as my own act of survival for myself, if I'm being honest, based on my own capacities and background and goals. I could not in good faith continue doing that frontline work and stay alive. And as the art world continues its merging in idealistic but perhaps not adequately supported ways with community-based initiatives and care praxis, it would follow that arts workers, and I'll include sessional instructors in the arts here too, as many sessionals themselves have their own active practices, will become entangled in such burnout too. After all, we are not robots or disembodied beings who can enact some idealistic standard of behavior simply by invoking it. Care written in an artist statement, care written in a curatorial essay, care written in didactic panels, care written all over the walls. We have a finite capacity for caring in the sense of literally giving a shit, for which compassion fatigue emerged in internet culture to describe the affective psychic burnout that we feel after an onslaught of issues to care about and show our support for online and IRL. So, burnout in the sense of feeling care toward the thing for which we care about, but also in the sense of acting on that feeling, on showing a caring act, on expending energy through physically doing something for somebody else, whether that's vocalizing support, actively listening, providing some form of service, and so on. The question of what kind of work is recognized as caring within the arts is one enmeshed in longstanding issues of interest to intersectional feminisms, including issues of invisible labor, unpaid labor, and what happens in the background. In 2014, when I was working on my zine Self-Care for Skeptics, I was serving on a board of an artist-run center in Toronto. After our meetings, my one female-identified friend noted how it was always a couple of women washing the dishes after the meetings and events in the tiny kitchen hidden in the back of the artist-run space. Was such maintenance work recognized as caring in the same way as, say, giving a curatorial talk on care to open an event? When it comes to establishing these standards of behavior in the arts and academia, it would behoove us, I think, to establish what happens in those moments when the standards fail to be met. What happens in those moments when the ideal of the caring artist, or the caring curator, or the caring arts administrator, or the caring director fails to uphold these standards? What happens then? I hope the answer is not to discard of them, like the logics of cancel culture. Alternatives to the carceral logic of cancel culture emerge from the margins, including BIPOC and trans thinking. From Kai-Cheng Tom's critiques of cancel culture in I Hope We Choose Love, to indigenous theories of restorative justice, which hold that everyone involved in conflict and harm, both those who perpetrate it and those who are the victims, deserve healing, community care, and the opportunity to grow. Does it follow that, to add another question to the mix, does it follow that if you are not caring, you are uncaring? These cases assume that some active perpetration of harm or conflict results from the lack of caring behavior. And the question of whether the absence of care leads to harm, or whether the absence of care is a kind of apathy and lack that as time passes enables a culture that is harmful, is another question. But I pose the issue of the failure of care here because it's something many of us in arts and academia believe to be true. Indeed, I've just been observing over the past year or so, the ways that care has become a kind of joke in some academic and art world circles. While the rhetoric of care lives on and well, people continue to, as the charge goes, not embody those standards of care. Most complicated in those cases where the person not being caring doesn't realize it, or wears the discursive banner of care around themselves and their work with pride, yet fails to practice what they preach. This gap between theory and practice is acknowledged to humorous effect in a recent meme that I have up on the screen now by Avocado Ibuprofen on Instagram, an anonymous meme administrator whose collaged and hand-drawn image text pairings look like an enmeshing of Xerox era 90s zine culture and post-internet worldings, and which critique, in often devastatingly apt, somewhat ironic, and post-confessional terms, broad and niche issues alike in the contemporary art world and its social spheres. And so here we, reading from the meme, It reads, if you can't handle me at my rambling low bit rate 2.5-hour long Zoom lecture on the importance of care, you don't deserve me at my slim cigarettes, dry Prosecco, and juicy scene gossip at the Kunsthal after party. And that's a post from December 14th, 2020, so quite recently. So pausing here and stepping back for a moment, what do we mean when we say care? And notably in this meme, a lecture on the words on the importance of care are held in scare quotes. So pausing here and stepping back for a moment, what do we mean when we say care? Care is tied to compassion, most often used in reference to professional social work, as I've discussed, such as the care of the sick and of the elderly. And this is where we get the language of care workers. Often, interestingly, the workers we now refer to in the language of war as those on the front lines. To fail to care, then, presents issues both morally and philosophically, but also, and most apparently, socially. This definition of care understands care as both the work and labor that it is, as well as the career path, a particular way of being in the world, in which art and academia, unless explicitly tied to care through programs such as art therapy, is nowhere to be seen. Care work now, though, has seemed to have entered the arts, possibly as part of a larger ethical turn that we've seen shaping cultural production and the way we understand and produce knowledge in these art and academic spaces over the past decade. As the poet Anne Boyer noted in conversation at the Auto conference that I was a part of at the Royal College of Arts, through the Royal College of Arts postgraduate writing program in London back in the spring of 2019, Boyer was describing the ways that Gen X, her generation, was anti-moral, even amoral, and that was what was cool if you had countercultural leanings. While the Gen Y of today is hyper-moral, ultra invested in being good, moral people, morally upstanding, morally superior even. Indeed, the shift toward care as both an interest and an imperative seems guided in part by contributions of feminisms historically, with critiques of issues like systemic oppression and structural forms of toxic behavior and abuse, as well as recent shifts towards social justice and ethical conduct in mainstream culture more broadly, embodied in tendencies toward calling out or calling in when someone is seen to be failing to uphold certain standards of pro-social behavior. This all the more charged and convoluted during our COVID-19 pandemic moment, when the imperatives to think about other people dictate our sheltering in place for an indeterminate period of time, wearing masks, and so on. To bring in another layer of this word care, its dense etymology, care also means to sorrow or to grieve, to mourn or to lament, to feel concern, whether great or little, to be troubled, uneasy, or anxious. This is where we get the idea of someone caring too much, as if being troubled by troubling conditions in the world is abnormal or pathological, rather than the normal and normative expected response. And to not care, then, is not only about not fulfilling an action of being caring, but it is also to be apathetic, to not feel concern, to not feel troubled or interested. Who cares? See if I care. But many of us care right now. And if we don't care, it's likely because we feel burnt out from caring, what has come to be called compassion fatigue. There are notably exceptions, of course, and it is important for me to introduce some terms here, like the idea, some terms here that are important, from being neurodivergent versus being so-called neurotypical, as a way of complicating any easy recourse to larger meta-narratives about empathy, capacity, and care, meta-narratives which I'm admittedly drawing from throughout this talk. There are other factors too worth mentioning, including those on the autism spectrum and with Asperger's, personality disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder, and psychopathy and sociopathy. All of these are a range of terms which are not equivalent, but invoked here as examples of factors that can complicate the assumption of how and to what extent humans experience empathy and care for others. and how that is communicated, how that care is communicated. Care fails in the face of precarity, exhaustion, compassion fatigue, which assumes a scarcity of resources personally, but also maybe collectively, in which you only have so much capacity for feeling compassion and demonstrating that compassion, whether online or in real life. The crisis of care then is not exactly a failure, but something in its proximity. And empathy, I think, might provide a response. With empathy comes energy. Empathy is the power of projecting one's personality into and so fully comprehending the object of contemplation. Sorry, I'm going to repeat that. Empathy as the power of projecting one's personality into and so fully comprehending the object of contemplation, a quite poetic definition from the Oxford English Dictionary that I'm going to return to. My first entry into the topic of care was back in 2014. I was struggling with my own capacities toward caring for myself, but was also, as a hypercritical and idealistic graduate student well-versed in critiques of neoliberalism and advanced late capitalism, wary of making a project about self-care. I scribbled out a call for submissions under the title Self-Care for Skeptics, writing out a paragraph blurb punctuated with open-ended bullet points, and publishing this on a Tumblr page. It moved through various social media channels, with my call seeming to tap into an interest that other artists had, culminating in a zine I published with the support and education of my printmaking friend and queer peer, Anthea Black. Self-Care for Skeptics led the way for me to start thinking more seriously about what it would mean to cultivate collective networks for caring, because it was clear that models of self-care were limited and ultimately and ironically self-defeating. When considered from an intersectional feminist vantage point, as my zine attempted, self-care is fundamentally ambivalent. On the one hand, to take care of the self can be reclaimed as a politicized act of autonomy and agency, in which those whose lives are oppressed and at risk uphold the value of their life against the odds set up against them. Their survival through caring for their self becomes a willful act of resistance in the face of forces like white supremacy and colonialism. Audre Lorde and Sarah Ahmed are among those who champion the viability of self-care as a form of warfare. It was clear through the many artists' responses in Self-Care for Skeptics that caring for themselves was an important act of affirming the legitimacy and value of their lives. With works like Chunhua Catherine Dong's photographs of her body imaged in a range of domestic spaces, to texts like Clementine Morrigan's manifesto as a traumatized, now sober femme witch. For anyone with a history of complex trauma and suicidal ideation, you understand that caring for yourself in the sense of giving a shit and then showing that care through some form of concerted action is in fact radical. All the more so when you repeat that day after day. If there was a larger argumentative arc that took shape in the curation of Self-Care for Skeptics, the thesis held that in order to be able to take care of ourselves, we had to take care of each other, and vice versa. We needed infrastructures of collective caring and support in order to have a viable present and future in which anyone felt cared for or, in truth, caring. The future, if we could imagine such a thing, seemed to lie in collective care. A photo essay by the Vancouver-based collective Radical Spirits, in which members of the collective took a synchronized swimming course together and documented it in underwater photographs, embodied this in the zine through their imagery, bodies moving together through the friction of water, buoyant and striving. Like most, if not all of my curatorial projects, this project began from a very personal place. Its earliest moments were in my practice as an artist, making artwork on my own about the topic. And I should note, there's just a bit of a content warning discussing, for the next part of the lecture, just discussing mental health issues in an abstract, quite an abstract way, but there will be issues that are named. So if you need to, take some time, feel free. So I was in art school then in Saskatchewan, wrestling with my seeming inability to take care of myself as a then 19-year-old art student, tortured by clinical depression and a nearly fatal eating disorder. It would only become apparent later on to be complex trauma as a result of suppressed sexual violence, when I'd found a therapist during my PhD, finally with the support of health benefits, courtesy of York University's notoriously strong and combative union, QP 3903. At the time, I was just barely holding on, moving through the world in a dissociative fugue, and feeling like I was quite literally at war with myself, warring against my own body actively. I remember presenting an installation to my intermediate class where I projected a video image of me into a shoebox. My professor, Rochelle Vader-Knowles, and my tiny cohort of about 4 other art students watched as this projection of me navigated around the shoebox like a mime. But the piece wasn't about being trapped in a box, figuratively speaking, so much as it was about my desire to double myself, to split apart from myself so that I might be able to take care of myself. I knew how to take care of others to some extent. I understood what it meant to feel care about another and to allow my energy to move toward this other being, another body, to give that energy and care out to them, often at the expense of caring for myself. And so I created a piece in which I could become something separate, a little being like a pet that I could keep in the shoebox and nourish and comfort and feed. Maybe then my life would be livable. Maybe then I would be able to show myself the kind of care that I needed and the kind of care that I wasn't getting from anyone else. In 2016, I began to become more interested in curating in a more, we could say serious way. As I did studio visits with artists and continued exploring my own interests and curiosities around the politics and aesthetics of care, I proposed a series of exhibitions that engaged these themes. The first was a group exhibition that emerged from a range of conversations with artists in which I was struck by the tendencies of their work to offer alternatives to dominant conceptions of healthcare. Whether it was There's a Cut Hands, Two-Spirit, Dreamcatcher special with self-care tools shared in community, to Patrina Ng's nuanced look at traditional Chinese medicine's approach to cancer, a work that was as much a grieving process as a meditation on the ways that both Western and Eastern medical information is communicated intergenerationally and cross-culturally. The exhibition convened around thinking through health, wellness, and care from a range of intersectional feminist viewpoints. The timing worked out well with my sharing the proposal with the director of the Blackwood Gallery at University of Toronto, Mississauga, Christine Shaw, who, as it so happened, was in the process of launching a year-long curatorial series called Take Care. The title I settled on for my exhibition was The Sustenance Right, RITE, which allowed me to think about the place of ritual, practice, or custom, right as an RITE, with human rights, justice, and equitable treatment, or right, RIGHT. Showing a clear continuation of the logics of self-care for skeptics, my curatorial essay for The Sustenance Right opened as follows, quote, "In a time of generalized anxiety, precarity, and upheaval, how do artists sustain themselves? How do we make what do we make of self-care imperatives in light of our late capitalist, neoliberal, neocolonial context? How do we care for others while also caring for ourselves?" End quote.
Begging your pardon, Lauren, could you repeat how the essay opened again?
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Quote, "In a time of generalized anxiety, precarity, and upheaval, how do artists sustain themselves? What do we make of self-care imperatives in light of our late capitalist, neoliberal, neocolonial context? And finally, how do we care for others while also caring for ourselves?" End quote. The works in this exhibition were framed as proffering alternatives to dominant discourses of health here on the colonized lands of so-called North America that are critical and reparative. Reflecting on the rights of mental, emotional, and physical health care in the contemporary moment, these artists' works made space for the rituals that sustained them. Humor played a key role in the exhibition, a tone I was guided by even as so much of the work came from a place that was undoubtedly somber, personal, and serious. It was important to me as a curator, and it continues to be important to me as a curator, to make space for catharsis. With comedy and humor, of course, there is the buildup of tension and then the release. Works like Evan Tyler's performance for camera, I'm Full of Myself in 2017, in which the artist, then in recovery for addictions, performs in his persona as the life coach, a motivational speaker and self-described spiritual psychiatrist from 1992, who, it seems, might be harboring his own violent narcissisms. Both performing and critiquing self-help culture, Tyler anachronistically appropriates the energy of the early 90s as a conceit to theatricalize an era and do the work of psychotherapeutic processing. In Thurza Cuthand's similarly anachronistic performance for camera, the artist takes the form of the TV infomercial to advertise and sell objects and support structures that she's devised that could contribute to the well-being of two-spirit people today, including a beaded whisk, a non-slip lube mat, and a telephone line responsive to problems specific to two-spirit people living in so-called Canada. Both cheeky and sincere, Cuthand's performance for video uses humor and play to flesh out the intersections of indigeneity, gender identity, and mad pride so central to her work over the past decades. This is another view of Evan's video installation and a view of Thurza's video installation in the space. My work with Anthea Black that began in Self-Care for Skeptics continued in this exhibition to expanding to her work with Jessica Lynn Whitbread. In the Self-Care for Skeptics scene, Black collaborated with her collective LIDS, Ladies Invitational Deadbeat Society, to create an artist multiple called the 10 Cognitive Distortions. It was a limited run piece that was included in the zine. In the 10 Cognitive Distortions, Black took a handout of the same title that had been given to her by her therapist, and the copy she received looked like it had already been Xeroxed from a copy of a copy of a copy. The collective then, in a conceptual act, continued to copy the handout until the text became virtually unintelligible. And so they mirrored the distortion that the document sought to describe and remedy. The cognitive distortions, the ways of thinking that are self-defeating and that distort reality, such as having all or nothing thinking. Now in this exhibition, Black collaborated with Whitbread, with whom she is involved as a lover and partner, as well as a collaborator, on an installation called Tea Time, Mapping Informal Networks for Women Living with HIV. This is a project led by Whitbread internationally that serves as a form of community building for women living with HIV to network, self-advocate, and share experiences and resources with each other. During the tea parties that Whitbread hosts, each woman brings a teacup and a letter that they have written, which they then leave behind in exchange for another teacup and letter that someone else brought. During our exhibition, which culminated with December 1st, which is World AIDS Day, Whitbread hosted an iteration of the Tea Party at the Blackwood. While taking place within the institutional confines of the University of Toronto, Mississauga, the event itself was private, with not even the curator, myself, in attendance. It was only for women living with HIV, which in this case included Jessica and a small group of women from the Mississauga area, half of whom were Indigenous. In communion together, the women met in the space of Whitbread and Black's installation, which the collaborators created together, a queer warmth emanating from Black's wallpaper piece entitled Eat Me, Drink Me, Take Tea With Me, after Alice Austen, as the backdrop, with these letters and teacups from past parties on display, and prints by Jess McCormick and Johnny Nowariak. And so there's a detailed view. Jessica produced a book documenting the larger project, which has been ongoing since 2014. And so that's visible on the table with a tea set. And this is an example of an artist's print. Power clashing there with the wallpaper. While the works in the exhibition spanned a range of tones, they were each grounded in autobiographical experiences, with artists making work from their own experiences of physical illness, of trauma, of mental health issues, of grief. All right, where I'm going a bit long here, so I might just skim past a bit of this. Artist Justice Walls's Anxiety Escape Kit held down the fort at the center on the grid of the exhibition's floor, reminding us of the desire many people with anxiety disorders have to simply run away, whether from this exhibition or any other space, to slip away unseen. A work of practical conceptualism, each escape kit is comprised of a suitcase and its contents, which includes an escape plan, a disguise, a set of distractions and coping mechanisms, and what Walls refers to as an activity set. So things like games, teddy bears, candy, neck pillows, accessible books like children's literature. The sculptures suggest that each kit can be easily packed up in its suitcase for ease of travel and use. There's a childlike quality to Waltz's work that gestures to how the desire for escape might also be a desire to return to a time of less responsibility and insecurity. The disguises are more akin to what a kid playing dress up in their parents' clothes might put on, comically conspicuous. And that's a detail view there. I continued along this path with my subsequent curatorial work, including Fermenting Feminism, which I will not discuss today, but which is well documented online. But I'm going to talk about an exhibition entitled Mental Health next, which Justice was also a part of. So next came an exhibition which I decided to name Mental Health, just Mental Health in all caps, because that felt like the most suited name and because I thought it would be funny. The exhibition was site responsive again, as my curatorial work tends to be, rooted in the specific context of the DIY project space White House Studio project located in Toronto's Kensington Market. Funded as part of the White House's In Space project, which focused on social issues in and around the GTA, my exhibition featured work by 4 emerging queer and feminist artists, primarily by Black, Indigenous, or POC, making work about mental health and mental illness from their own lived experiences. The artists and I also took part in hosting a roundtable on mental health and housing in Toronto, which was held at the Artists Health Alliance off Yonge Street, and which was well attended by members of the community, which included those identifying as psychiatric survivors, artists with lived experience, and even, quite interestingly, a few psychiatrists. And so here's some images of the roundtable. We have Fionn Liu and Justice Walls, 2 of the artists who had work in the exhibition and were part of the roundtable, and then us as a group. Kayla Polan's video, How to Be a Mental Health Millionaire, embodied the humor of the exhibition most clearly and was made specifically for the exhibition. Polan developed it in response to conversations that we were having about this exhibition and its themes. She performed as the contestant playing the game, with James Knott standing in as the game show host. In addition to addressing topics like depression, anxiety, alcoholism, and self-sabotage, using memes and performance for camera to comedic effect, Polan also took up some of the thorniest topics around accountability culture and support in post-internet millennial culture, including in the still scene here, where under hard to swallow pills, the options given include, quote, I'm not entitled to anyone's time, and people being busy doesn't mean they're abandoning me, end quote. And, quote, mental illness and past traumas are not valid excuses to avoid accountability for perpetuating toxic, manipulative, or abusive behaviors, end quote. Other works like Kedra Mensah's project look specifically to experiences of mental health in Black women through hair dye and straightening products. This exhibition took the form of 4 discrete but interlocking installations, which each created their own immersive space. So here's that's a detailed view of Kedra's project, and we see so we had a full store aisle taken from like Shoppers Drug Mart, mimetically reproduced here, but then there are these small iterative changes which are seen in the packaging, which the artist called Dark and Lonely, which the artist created herself. The exhibition took the form of these discrete interlocking installations, and each of the artists spent time in the space as visitors attended. So this exhibition was much more experimental and low budget. It was up for less than a month, but it brought in more viewers than some other exhibitions I've curated, benefiting perhaps from the great influx of people of diverse backgrounds who came out to the market during the street fairs. And also, interestingly enough, we had a lot of crossover from folks who had attended the mental health roundtable and were a part of those communities coming into the art space and spending time with the work. In exhibitions like these, both the curation and the art making, I think, come from a place of an earnest interest in care, with all of us existing somewhere on a spectrum of what that care means, looks like, and implicates through our practices of making and living. It might come from a place of wanting to better understand the nature of care and how care and art converge, as it certainly did for me as a curator. What possibilities exist for caring forms of art making, curation, and perhaps even criticism. This is a less cynical approach than some of those I've seen starting to crop up around me and parodied to caustic degree in memes like the one showed by Avocado Ibuprofen. And these critiques are important, lest care take off as rhetoric without needing any grounding in practice. We need those critiques. The most cynical reading, I think, would assume that an institution is just using the discourse of care as rhetoric to disguise or hide uncaring behavior. Care, 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 we care, like Bell's mental health campaign maybe, and other corporate and neo-corporate structures attempting to affirm their humanity through language like that of caring. These critiques are important because, of course, the rhetoric can be used to obfuscate the practice. Of course, there are times when the rhetoric and the practice will not match up. And this is what I see as the crisis of care that contemporary art and curation especially is facing right now. It is not so much about individuals failing, but the social structures not being adequate. And just because there is a crisis of care does not mean that every time the word care is invoked to frame a project or a mode of thinking, it is hypocritical or void. If we approach the crisis of care from a more affirming place, and here I borrow language from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who supplants what she calls the paranoid forms of reading, like Derrida's deconstruction, with more reparative modes. We might be able to move through this current quagmire of caring versus uncaring and emerge with a set of tools, practices, language, and frameworks that allow us to support each other and to hold each other accountable without assuming the worst, without discarding or canceling if someone fails, without refusing to give others the benefit of the doubt. And most importantly, structures that allow us to be caring in a sustainable way, where sustainability here really seems to be at the crux of the issue. And it is here, I believe, where empathy might enter the picture. Over the coming day, we'll be convening around ideas of empathy and bridging the gap between feeling and action, as the organizers put it. This is also to say a bridging of the gap between rhetoric and practice, or between theory and practice, between art and living. To speak of bridging this gap between feeling and rhetoric on the one hand and practice on the other, we are assuming that feeling and rhetoric can occupy the same space, that what one puts out there into the world rhetorically and discursively is also what one feels in their belly and in their heart, what one feels compelled to do. Is it fair to assume that other people in the arts and academia are so attuned to their feelings? I think so. Here, discourse is the drive, something that motivates our work. Care is something that one feels compelled by, a caring for or a caring about, something one feels compelled to do. But caring takes work. Caring takes energy. It is quite literally an expenditure of energy. And the question of who is expending the energy and work of care, for whom, and to what ends is now raised. Once the energy has been expended, how can it be replenished? Is caring a renewable resource? Is empathy a renewable resource? If care fails us, can empathy step in to help with this work? Empathy might be another framework, a perhaps more flexible one, because it is so fundamentally abstract. And so looking at the quote here, again, I'm drawing, this was the OED definition that I found quite beautifully abstract, actually, and almost a bit impossible. I want to talk about that. This power of projecting one's personality into and so fully comprehending the object of contemplation. This feels like fundamentally an impossible definition. It is flexible and accommodating, more so than care, by virtue of its technical impossibility, by virtue of its speculative nature, its hopefulness towards something, its attempts to project oneself into the other in order to understand. Empathy is a way of relating between the self and the other, between the I and the not I. In this way, empathy marks a kind of impossibility, something imagined, fictive, attempted, speculative, but also material. I am very curious about the possibility of an understanding and non-idealized approach to empathy as a way of transforming our current institutions and social structures in contemporary art and in the university. And so some closing reflections here. The path of the empath is one of plight, certainly. I know I personally feel like I feel things too much, meaning that I absorb my environment like a sponge, take in all the affect, feel it in my body in a way that is not always productive. Sometimes this is an overwhelming sadness or anger or an overflow of grief. To feel things too much, or put another way, for the situation of the empath to be one of plight, a sorry situation, given the structures we have inherited and work within, unfriendly to such intensity of empathic feeling and empathic forms of relating, because the feelings can be too much to bear. Where do we put it? I had an idea once for an art project, which I'd still like to realize, called the Hysterical Renewable Energy Machines. The premise was that I would design speculative machines that could transmit useless emotions, all of the excessive ones, excessive sadness, anger, add to that maybe mania, all of those emotions that you fail to sublimate toward useful or even livable, manageable ends. These machines, as I imagined them, could take those useless emotions and transmute them into a renewable energy source, not unlike a solar power grid or a wind turbine. I imagine these machines in each of our homes, us being able to lean over into them, expel all of our excessive emotionality into these machines so that they are used toward the common good, so that they can serve as fuel for the kinds of social structures and communities that we want to foster, the kinds of networks that we want to be a part of, the new institutions that we want to build. The renewable energy would allow these models to be sustainable. Empathy is a form of energy transfer, as I've been discussing, a form of projection, maybe the good kind of projection. It's a transfer of energy, a way of moving from yourself to another. And in this way is a kind of flight. The plight of the empath is also a flight outside of ourselves and toward, into another, our object of contemplation, the person that we are orienting our capacity for empathy toward. The artist Adrian Piper's thoughts on abstraction as flight come to mind here as I reflect on this definition of empathy. Empathy as this flight-like power of projecting oneself outside of oneself, or put another way, as transcending the immanence of oneself, to exceed the bounds of our own embodied immanence, to transcend towards something more like collectivity, to acknowledge ourselves as always already in excess of ourselves, the affective energy we possess in our bodies vibrating outward and emanating, the billions of microbes living in our guts, finding sustenance in our own bodies, nourishing ours in turn. Thank you.
I think this is the part where I come in, Lauren. Well, the very first thing that I want to say, this is usually the part where we, thank you for your gracious talk and so forth. And I really want to thank you for your gracious talk, because I think what I've seen, and I think the other, dozens of us have witnessed right now, is a kind of care and compassion in an academic keynote that is extremely rare. And I mean that in a couple of ways. I think the first thing that I would love to think about with you, while our incredible folks out there in the ether realm are coming up with their own questions that have emerged out of your rich talk. The thing that I would love to point out is that your talk in a way was a kind of meta-analysis of what it means to care within academic parlance, what it means to curate a talk that includes within it deeply personal and subjective views and life experiences that seamlessly melds scholarly and theoretical and historical phases. It also so beautifully brings in art projects, both your own and others, curatorial projects. So really what I'd love to ask you to start out is how have you developed this way of delivering an address that embodies in itself the kind of care and compassion that you use as a subject matter, but I think you also embody as, in this case, a speaker, but I can feel it in your curatorial practice, in your teaching, I'm sure, in your writing. When did this come to you, or has this always been a way that you've operated within the world?
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I really, really appreciate those reflections. It feels very affirming and means a lot. So thank you. Yeah, I think, I guess the short answer would be no, and this is new. So I kind of feel like something's finally clicked for me, where it's been a year of, I've been thinking a lot about ideas of integration. And I think I'm someone who's always felt like all these discrete, I'm sure there's listeners out there who can relate, it's like, okay, I'm a curator, artist, writer, social worker, I haven't even really talked about being like a first generation student or academic coming from like a working class background. And like, there's all these kinds of different, discrete parts of me that I've always felt not only are separate, but I struggle to understand how to integrate. And I know I've been thinking, the recent book that I wrote is on this idea of auto theory, in terms of that bridging of the autobiographical and the theoretical. And something I was really compelled by in a lot of auto-theoretical writing is the way that it shuttles between many registers, the way that it can interweave a range of stories, a range of registers of thinking, different topics and themes. So perhaps it's because I've been spending so much time with that kind of work that I finally feel like it's clicking for me in my writing, that I can just start working that way without actually really thinking about it too much on a conscious level. But yeah, I think as I put this together, it was interesting when first being asked to do this, I was thrilled and honored. And I was also like, I've actually never thought about empathy. I don't know if I've ever really sat down to think about empathy in any kind of conscious or critical way. And so I really, value having this space to share it. I'm looking forward to what everyone has to say tomorrow in terms of, thinking about this topic. But as I was starting to think about empathy through this idea of the crisis of care, because that's certainly something that's been on my mind, and just kind of, I feel like that's my way of being, is just kind of observing, the trends that I see around me. And I'm starting to see care being critiqued and kind of like roasted all of the time. And so it's kind of like, okay, so is empathy the next, turn? But then the more and more I start thinking about it, it's like, yeah, I think there's really something to this idea of, getting outside of ourself and, what that means to start working that way. So anyway, I feel like I'm digressing a bit, but as far as I do feel like this feels very new to me, and maybe it's because I've been coming out of my own 13-month dark night of the soul, having to do a lot of my own personal work and reflection, and just spending hard time with myself, that I kind of feel like I'm finally able to work in the way that feels very honest to me. And so I guess I just want to, note that and say how grateful I am for the space to work through these ideas, publicly, and also how I would like to encourage those who might be in a more emerging place, et cetera, to just keep following your gut and doing the kinds of work you want to do, because I say this to my students too, like often it really is in connecting points of connection that might seem really oblique, really strange, like that's where I think the interesting work happens. And, you know, tuning into your own life and the specificity of your lives as a site of knowledge and theorizing is so rich. Like I can't, you know, state that enough.
And Ren, I mean, do you feel as if the same turn has happened in your writing as well? I mean, it's something to produce a book for MIT and, you know, have to comply with sort of editorial questions that are posed to you and so forth. But do you feel like you're developing this kind of voice, both in your writing, in your teaching, your curating, and your speaking simultaneously? Or is this caring, empathic way registering in certain of those productions at different times and durations than in others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's probably registering in different times and directions. There was the irony that I wrote my PhD dissertation on this idea of auto theory. It was like a feminist kind of art historiography, but in an English department. And I was thinking about, you know, but that basically it came up of class is startlingly absent. That's something I think about in my own life, but I had somehow, you know, just kept it completely separate from my otherwise intersectional feminist analysis. And, you know, I was startlingly absent. And so that was something that I don't think I felt like I had the space for, or that I was, you know, had attained the academic legitimacy that I needed to attain through more traditional channels and more impersonal channels. And I was aware of the deep, deep irony of that based in my project. So when it came to writing the book, I'm a little bit more present, but it's interesting. You know, I feel like finally now I'm working on a new book project, a couple new book projects, and those are ones where I very much feel like, yeah, I want the, it's being guided from a fundamentally auto-theoretical place, because that's what feels the most honest. And I guess I kind of finally feel like I have the permission. If I'm being honest, I don't know if it's because I've already attained, you know, I did the PhD, I kind of checked off certain institutional boxes, and now I feel like I have the honest, you know, I feel like I have the freedom to do that, because that's certainly something yeah, like I admit that with some ambivalence, and that's something I witnessed. Someone like Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who I mentioned, I remember I took a directed reading on her work back in Vancouver when I was a master's student, and it struck me. I'm like, oh yeah, she had to, you know, write her books and do her work on like 19th century literature as a traditional literary, and before she wrote her book Touching Feeling, you know, and on. So
yeah. Super. Well, it's very invigorating and inspiring for all of us. And it's lovely to hear that this opportunity has given you a chance to think about empathy. And one of the questions that's come in from our audience is from Laurence Pilon. And they write, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on a possibility of a more post-humanist approach to empathy, as opposed to a humanist one, as suggested with the definition provided, i.e. the projection of a personality. The question is, what could we gain as humans to welcome and practice empathy otherwise, as a projection of ... So instead of a projection of personality, is there a projection of something else in a post-humanist manner?
I love that. I certainly love that, you know, the projection of something else. Yes, I definitely am all for making that definition more capacious and more open. And I know I just had it very subtly in there at the very end, but kind of ending on that post-humanist note about the microbes, because, you know, a lot of my work has been on fermentation, and I was really drawn to ideas of fermentation as embodying simultaneously preservation and transformation. So when approaching like feminist histories, but then thinking about, you know, what can we take from what we've learned, what do we preserve, what do we honor, what do we transform, you know, what do we allow to decay or evaporate, etc. I think this idea of a post-humanist conception of empathy, yes, I mean, as soon as we start to tune into our bodies and what we are, we realize that we are fundamentally more than human. And so now when I actually teach post-humanism in my art history course, we think about it, I call it like, you know, post-human and the more than human, because thinking about microbes and all the fantastic work that's happening around microbial life, Tiffany Jayon Shin's work. They're always making, right in the chat here, but they're always making fantastic work that's really at the, I think, the boundary point of ideas of post-humanist conceptions of microbes. And they just, there's a new exhibition of theirs up in New York right now. But yeah, thinking about, gut feelings in the sense of the many microbes and other forms of life that are like on our skin, within our bodies. So I think it's almost, yes, it would be fundamentally like false to try to pretend that we are some self-enclosed I.
And it's interesting that you combine the gut, and I'm wondering about empathy. I mean, when I have an intuitive feeling about something or towards someone, how interesting that maybe the source of empathy is actually in the gut, and maybe that is coming from the post-human part of ourselves that is more microbial or animal than we care to admit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yes. My short answer is just like yes, because I think too, like, even I guess, yeah, going on this point of empathy, think about multi-species symbiosis, but then multi-species empathy. Like, there's a lot of interesting work that's been thinking about. I think of this video called Family Jewels by a Chicago-based couple, Eleanor Adreva and Leo Williams, where they're thinking about their many ferments, but also vermicompost worms and like kefir grains and stuff as their babies.
Exactly.
Totally. It's like their queer family. And so it's, empathy is certainly a part of that. Care is a part of that. They're like, these are our, as they put it, they're like, this is our queer family. These are like the children we've invested in, the future we've invested in. So, but yeah, no, I'd certainly be interested in exploring that more. I feel like we're in such a kind of speculative place with empathy right now. And that's what really struck me about even this quite standard historical OED definition is it's like, it already feels speculative and abstracting. So it's like we can kind of keep riding that wave and add in the post-human element, add in.
Ren, if I can just shift gears slightly to, again, entice some questions from the audience. This is a slightly more art historical, curatorial question. And I'm wondering if you see a trajectory or some kind of path that links where we might be right now in this empathetic or care-based engagement with a series of previous practices. And I'll just, I don't mean to throw out jargon, but I think that some of us will recognize some of these: relational aesthetics, social practice, site responsive or site specificity, happenings, data, conversazione, salons in the non-Diderotian sense. I mean, those, in some ways, I kind of see those as a series of previous attempts for a kind of compassionate or at least interhuman set of relations between humans, objects, artworks, architectures. Do you see a kind of linkage between those practices and where we are now? Or do you think that we're at a different spot right now that we've never really engaged?
That's a great question. I certainly see linkages. I mean, yeah, to your point of like fluxus happenings or, attempts at having some kind of like instigating some kind of collectivity. We certainly see a lot of that. Maintenance art within like and that term within feminist art practice, body art as trying to think about that relation between like subjectivity, objectivity, but it's hard to say because I wasn't there, but I just have the sense, as a student of art history, that in those moments, I think of like the happenings, for example, that there was something that it was maybe driven from a more conceptual place. And that now we're in this, even when I mentioned that Anne Boyer quote where she was talking about like even just the shift from like Gen X to Gen Y of this kind of like amoral versus hypermoral, I think that right now we're in a time of being guided by a kind of moral imperative in a way that we haven't necessarily seen in the past. That's my sense anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Cynthia Hammond, who's one of our professors in the department, has written, and I think sort of collectively drawing from her doctoral students with whom she's been discussing some of these issues. And I'll read what she writes to you, Lauren. Thank you for this brilliant and I think very necessary talk. I'm hoping that some doctoral students who I spoke with a few weeks ago are here. They were concerned that having care at the center of their scholarship would never be taken seriously within the academy. I hope they run out and buy your book. I visited your website and I'm so impressed by the range and diversity of your practice, author, zine creator, teacher, artist, and so on. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the different aspects of your work are, or are not, ways of caring for other parts of your work. In other words, and without wishing to draw arbitrary distinctions between the various facets of an interdisciplinary practice, does writing provide a source of care or sustenance for your creative work, or vice versa? Thank you again for your talk, she says.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's incredibly generous. That is a really interesting question and one I've never really thought about before. But I would say yes, I do think that writing nourishes the other practices. That's something else that I've kind of come to recognize in myself, that writing, first and foremost, I think I would call myself a writer because that is the practice which feels, the most natural to me, the one that just feels the most kind of fundamentally nourishing. And then that in turn nurtures the curation and the art. But as far as, the reason I mentioned the fact that I think all of my curatorial projects had earlier roots in what I see as like kind of lonely, sad girl art making, is that there's something actually caring about curation. Like curation cared for me in the sense of realizing you're not alone in the ideas you're interested in. And I think that's where zine making came in. Fermenting Feminism, I put out a similar call with self-care, where it was, before many people were really like thinking of those intersections, and it just like you kind of put out a call to the world, realizing actually like these are collective concerns. Here are opportunities for collaboration, and then that becomes a source of nourishment, I guess would be one way of putting it, or care. So I think that curation for me, maybe curation was I feel like I'm in a psychotherapist chair right now having a breakthrough moment, but maybe curation for me was caring for myself in a certain way too. But I think, as far as having the different practices, I do think it just comes from like a gut-driven place of just kind of feeling compelled toward different things. And I actually am grateful and indebted to my very first art prof, Rochelle Vieder-Knowles, who I mentioned, because I was in an intermedia studio program, and the whole logic of that program is, you start with an idea, and whatever medium makes sense, go with that. And so I think that's similar for me. I'll have an idea. Does it make sense to pursue this as like a curatorial project or a book, a video?
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yes. We're nearing 7:30, so I'm going to give one last word out there. If anybody wants to pose a question to Lorraine, who's been so generous and very honest with her time with us. If not, can I just throw one? It's I don't want to say it's inconsequential, but it is linguistic. I'm interested in the word curator, and you took that apart etymologically for us, which is very useful. And I'm wondering if you've thought very much about other terminologies that are used within the museological frame around this practice. And I'm thinking of the word keeper, which is often used in the United Kingdom and other places. And I have to admit, I would love to know across multiple languages what the word is that is used for what we say is curator. Because I mean, even between curator and keeper, there are vast, both ontological and etymological differences. Do you know about this? Do you think about this in terms of how we look at the idea of curare to care for across different cultures and languages?
Yeah, I mean, now I do want to see the translation breakdown. That could be really a really interesting project for someone to do. Keeper, yes, I'm familiar with keeper, and like organizer. I feel like that's emerging more here in North America, and maybe there's something about more of a kind of like activistic roots, or the sense of like a community organizer, or one who's I think my sense of that term emerging and some people identifying with that instead of curator is because of maybe that sense of the curator as auteur, like that it's taken on some kind of baggage, or it's seen as like the gallerina kind of diva-y curator role versus like an organizer, like emphasizing the labor and the work of it, maybe. Or ideas of like directing and producing. Like I feel like there's been maybe some more language that emphasizes the labor from a kind of less specifically art-based place.
Right, like programmer is often used in performing arts or film, and so many projects. So Sky Gooden has piped up with a wonderful question, so I'd like to share this with you now. She says, "Hi, Lauren. I'm trying to find the article I read in CMAG a few years ago that informs this question, but without that link, and in the interest of time, allow me to paraphrase that the piece was about the co-option of self-care in contemporary art discourse from its root in marginalized labor and intersectional Black feminism. Wondering about your thoughts on this."
Yeah, thank you, Sky. Okay, I'm not familiar with this piece, so I'm just reading the question here to make sure I understand.
Oh, can you see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Co-option of self-care in contemporary art discourse from its root in marginalized labor and intersectional Black feminism.
So maybe, Sky, I mentioned Audre Lorde's work with like kind of earlier definitions of self-care emerging from, Black writers and theorists and activists like Audre Lorde who were reclaiming self-care, like against the kind of neoliberalizing models being seen as like, for Audre Lorde, it's like, okay, actually self-care is an act of warfare. It's a radical act of caring for myself as a Black, queer, lower class woman. So that would be, I have a sense of those roots of the history of self-care. I'm not sure if that's getting at what you're asking though, Sky. And I am curious about this piece in CMAG because I'm admittedly not familiar with it.
Well, could be. I'm not sure about how the day will run tomorrow, but I'm hoping that there are some breakout sessions or some times for Q&A, more casual discussion, so we can all go home tonight and find out whatever the.
I have like one more point I could add though, actually, because I think it's important. So like I know, like thinking, Sky, to your question, like ideas of self-care language and also even this term auto theory, which my book is on, are seen maybe, and maybe this is getting at what you're asking, seen as like a new thing or something that's like emergent in the late 20th century or early 21st century. And in seeing it that way, it erases these much longer histories that, in the case of auto theory, certainly, and also self-care, have much longer roots in, on the margins, a lot of Black women of color, artists and writers and theorists who were effectively doing this work or writing in this way or thinking in this way without it necessarily being described as such, or without it getting, the canonical recognition that, so I do certainly, I'm very much aware of that tendency. And in my auto theory book, it's like addressing this idea of like auto theory being a new genre, because really, we see it in the work of Adrian Piper in the 70s. We see it in Gloria Ianzaldua's writings in the 1980s. Like we see this whole kind of much longer lineage that, for too long has gone under-recognized. So.
Super. For all those who want to know, Sky is writing, yes.
Great, so, okay. Yeah, I hope that helped. I'm going to look up the CMAG piece now too.
Oh, wonderful. Lauren, thank you so much. You've you know, held the space for 90 minutes and more, and we want to make sure that we take care of you tonight and let you take a rest before you join us for the rest of the weekend. And thank you for curating just a gorgeous and really soulful talk, but also fantastically thought-provoking and yeah, just a really important example of how a keynote address can be given. So
thank you.
I personally want to thank you. I'll thank you on behalf of our audience, and I'll turn it over to Sarah to say goodnight to us all.
Great, thank you so much. I also just want to thank everyone who's here, you know, the participants, and for tuning in and listening. You know, that's its own form of generosity, and I do hope you got something out of it. Feel free to follow up with me too. I should have noted, I did have a slide before, but I'm at lgfournier@gmail.com. I'm at lgfournier on Instagram and Twitter. And I also want to thank you, Rebecca, for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Likewise.
Thanks. And thank you to the organizers. I'm really excited for tomorrow.
Oh, I think you both just took the words out of my mouth. Thank you both so much. I feel like I'm coming out of this so inspired and ready for tomorrow as well. I felt like that was a really enlightening talk and discussion, and I feel like it's really set the tone for the rest of the conference. So I'm very appreciative. Thank you both. I also wanted to thank our tech support, Alex, for helping us through this whole thing. And if you wish to attend any of the other panels and our closing keynote tomorrow, if you go to our Instagram, so it's AHGSA, AHGSA Concordia, you will find all the registration links there, as well as a link to our virtual vitrine exhibition, which is connected to this conference. So it's on the same theme of empathy, and was curated by our special projects coordinators, Michelle Sones and Megan Gaudette. And lastly, like Loren and Rebecca, I would like to thank you for attending, because these conferences wouldn't be possible without you supporting us and helping us gain this experience as graduate students and scholars. So thank you very much. And I wish you a very, very good night. And I hope to see some of you tomorrow as well. So thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night,
everybody.
Good night.